The sun over Calidad was a merciless white eye, bleaching the sky and baking the dust into a fine, choking powder. It was a town that had surrendered, its buildings slumped like tired old men against a horizon that promised nothing but more heat and more distance. Eli Mercer rode in slow, his horse, Buck, stepping carefully as if it knew the ground here was thin. He felt the town watch him, a collective stare from the shadows of porches and the grimy windows of the general store. It was a familiar feeling, the sullen suspicion of a place with secrets to keep. For weeks, he'd been following the whispers, a trail of sorrow that led him across the territory. A girl gone from a Kansas farm, 2 orphans vanished from a church mission, a young woman who'd simply stepped out for water and never returned. The whispers all tangled together here, in this sun-scoured settlement clinging to the Mexican border, and they all carried the same name, Deacon Kell. The sheriff's office was the cleanest building on the street. A man with a drooping mustache and a star pinned to a sweat-stained vest sat behind the desk, polishing a silver dollar until it gleamed. He looked up as Eli's shadow fell across the doorway, his eyes flat and incurious. "Looking for someone," Eli said, his voice low and raspy from the trail. "Most folks are," the sheriff replied, not stopping his polishing. "Most folks don't find 'em here." "I heard a man named Deacon Kell runs a saloon," Eli continued, ignoring the dismissal. "The Golden Songbird." The sheriff's hand stilled. He placed the dollar down on the desk with deliberate care. "Mr. Kell is a businessman. Provides entertainment, a place for a man to wash the trail dust from his throat. Nothing more." His eyes flicked towards the far end of the street, a silent direction and a warning all in one. He did not want a conversation. He wanted Eli to move on. Eli had seen 100 lawmen like him, men who wore a badge as a shield for their own cowardice, who'd traded their duty for a quiet life paid for by the devil. He gave a slow nod and backed out of the office, the stare of the town following him as he led Buck to the livery. The air was thick with things unsaid, with a tension that coiled in the gut. This was the place. He could feel the wrongness of it, a sickness that had settled deep in the town's bones, the same sickness that had taken his sister, Sarah, all those years ago. The Golden Songbird was louder than the rest of the town combined. Its bat-wing doors flapped open and shut, spilling yellow light and the tinny clang of a poorly tuned piano onto the street. Eli pushed through them and stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. The air was heavy with the smell of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and cheap perfume. Men hunched over tables, their faces lit by lanterns, their glances hard and assessing. They were prospectors, drifters, and ranch hands. But there was another kind of man here, too. Men with guns worn low and easy, their eyes never settling, always watching. Kell's men. Then he saw her. She was on a small, raised platform in the corner, a guitar resting in her lap. She was not singing yet, just watching the crowd with an unreadable expression. Her hair was the color of dark honey, pinned up in a way that looked elegant and careless all at once. A dress the color of a faded sapphire clung to her shoulders, simple but clean. She was beautiful, but it was not a soft beauty. It was sharp, like a shard of glass, something forged in hardship. There were shadows under her eyes that no amount of light could chase away. When she began to sing, the room quieted. Her voice was not angelic or sweet. It was smoky and raw, full of a pain that she seemed to mock with every note. It was a song about a woman who loved a gambling man and lost everything. But she sang it with a defiant tilt to her chin, as if she were proud of the ruin. The men watched her, their faces slack with a mixture of desire and something else, a kind of frustrated reverence. They wanted her, but they seemed to understand she was beyond their reach. After the song, she set the guitar aside and stepped down from the platform. A path cleared for her as she moved toward the bar. She poured herself a glass of water, ignoring the offers of whiskey from the men nearby. Eli noticed she never let anyone get behind her, and her hands, though graceful, were never far from the folds of her skirt. He'd bet his last dollar she had a weapon hidden there. He'd seen that same coiled readiness in cornered animals. She must have felt his gaze because her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, found his. She held his stare for a long moment before walking toward him, her steps measured and sure. She stopped before his table, her presence silencing the low conversations around them. "You're new," she said. It was not a question. Her voice was lower now, without the strain of the song, but just as rough around the edges. "Just passing through," Eli answered. A cynical smile touched her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. "They all are. What's your name?" "Cowboy." "Eli Mercer." "Clara," she offered, though he had a feeling it was not the name she was born with. "Well, Eli Mercer, you've got a look about you. A man on a mission. Let me guess. You're here to right some wrong, save a damsel in distress?" Her tone was laced with sarcasm. Eli said nothing, just watched her. He saw the faint tremor in her hand as she rested it on the back of a chair, the way her jaw was set. She was putting on a performance, same as when she was on that stage. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was meant for him but loud enough for the men nearby to hear. "I'll save you the trouble. I'm no virgin, and I don't need a hero." She straightened up, her eyes flashing a challenge. "So you can ride on out of here come morning. There's nothing in Caledad for a man like you to save." It was a lie, bald and desperate. Eli had heard a version of it before from women whose choices had been stolen from them so long ago they'd forgotten what it felt like to have any. It was a wall built of shame and fear, meant to keep everyone out. He saw the ghost of his sister in the defiant set of Clara's shoulders, the same false pride she had worn to hide her breaking heart. He didn't call her on it. He didn't argue. To do so would be a cruelty, an act of stripping away the only armor she had left. Instead, a slow, sad half-smile touched his own lips. "All right," he said softly. His simple agreement seemed to unnerve her more than any protest would have. Her composure flickered. She searched his face for judgment, for pity, for the lust she saw in every other man's eyes. She found none of it. She only found a quiet understanding that felt more dangerous than anything else in the room. She turned without another word and walked back to the bar, her back ramrod straight. Eli finished his drink and left the saloon. The night air was cooler, but the tension of the town still clung to him like a shroud. He walked the perimeter of the buildings, his hand resting on the Colt at his hip. He was listening, watching. In a place like this, the truth was never spoken in the light. It was found in the alleys, in the things people tried to hide. He found it behind the saloon. A muted cry, quickly stifled, the sound of a struggle. Eli flattened himself against the rough-hewn wall of the building and peered around the corner. Two burly men, their faces brutish in the moonlight, were dragging a girl toward a wagon hitched in the darkness. She couldn't have been more than 15, her face pale with terror, a piece of cloth stuffed in her mouth. She fought, kicking and twisting, but she was no match for them. A cold fire ignited in Eli's chest. It was the fire that had driven him for 10 years, ever since he'd found Sarah in that filthy room in St. Louis, wasted away to nothing, her spirit snuffed out by men just like these. He didn't think. He acted. He moved from the shadows like a predator. The first man grunted in surprise as Eli's arm wrapped around his throat from behind, cutting off his air before the second man could even turn. Eli slammed the first man's head into the side of the wagon. The man collapsed in a heap. The second thug released the girl and drew his pistol, but Eli was already on him. He grabbed the man's gun hand, twisting it until the bone snapped with a sickening crack. The man screamed, the gun clattering to the ground. Eli did not stop. He drove his fist into the man's jaw, then again into his gut. He fought with a contained, terrifying violence, each blow precise and punishing. He was not trying to kill them. He was delivering a message written in pain. When the second man was curled on the ground, groaning, Eli stood over him, his chest heaving. The girl was huddled against the wall, her eyes wide with fear and shock. Eli looked down at the conscious thug. "You tell Deacon Kell," he said, his voice a low growl, "that he's been warned. Let the girl go." He turned to the girl, his expression softening. He reached out and gently pulled the gag from her mouth. "Go on now," he said quietly. "Get back inside. Don't come out again tonight." She stared at him for a second, then scrambled to her feet and fled, vanishing into the back door of a neighboring boarding house. Eli watched her go before turning his attention back to the men on the ground. He picked up their gun and emptied the chambers, tossing the useless firearm into the dust. Then he melted back into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared. He had not gone 20 paces when a voice stopped him. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" It was Clara. She stood at the end of the alley, her arms crossed, her body rigid with fury. The moonlight caught the silver sheen of tears on her cheeks, but her voice was hard as stone. "Those men work for Kell," she hissed, stepping closer. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? You've just painted a target on your back, and on hers." "Someone had to do something," Eli said, his own anger still simmering just beneath the surface. "You saw that girl. You knew what they were planning." "Of course I knew," she shot back, her voice breaking. "I know everything that happens in this rotten town. Knowing and stopping it are two different things. You ride in here for one day and think you can change the world with your fists? It's a start." "It's a death sentence," she cried, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "For you, for me, for that girl. Kell doesn't take kindly to interference. He owns the sheriff. He owns this whole town. He'll make that girl pay for what you did. He'll make us all pay." "And what's your solution?" Eli challenged, his voice dangerously quiet. "To just stand by and sing your sad songs while he sells children out the back door? To watch it happen and tell yourself it's the price of survival?" Her face crumpled, the accusation hitting its mark. "You don't know anything about me," she whispered, her anger dissolving into a raw, painful vulnerability. "You stand there and judge me, but you have no idea what it costs to wake up every morning in this place. You have no idea what I've done to stay alive." "I'm not judging you," Eli said, his voice softening. "I'm asking you to stop lying to yourself." She flinched as if he'd struck her. Without another word, she turned and fled back toward the saloon, leaving him alone in the alley with the groans of Kell's men and the suffocating silence of the night. Later that night, from the small window of her upstairs room, Clara watched him. She'd expected him to take a room, to be where Kell's men could find him, but he did not. He led his horse to the edge of town, just beyond the last dilapidated shack, but still within sight of the saloon. He unsaddled Buck and used his saddle as a pillow, rolling himself in his bedroll with his rifle laid beside him. He chose the open, dangerous ground over the feigned safety of a roof. He chose to sleep under the vast, uncaring blanket of the stars. Clara stood at her window for a long time, a knot of confusion and fear tightening in her chest. For years, her survival had depended on understanding men, their greed, their lust, their weaknesses. But Eli Mercer was a language she did not speak. He did not want what other men wanted. He looked at her and saw something other than a body to be used. He saw the truth she kept buried so deep she could barely remember it herself. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. The wind began to pick up, rattling the loose pane of her window. Dark clouds swallowed the moon, and the first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, kicking up the dust in the street below. A storm was rolling in off the plains, a violent, angry thing. Clara closed the window and retreated to her narrow bed, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. The sound of the rising wind and the drumming rain was a familiar lullaby from a childhood she could barely recall. But tonight, it offered no comfort, As the thunder began to rumble in the distance, she drifted into an uneasy sleep, and the nightmares came. She was small again. In a wagon, the canvas flap tied shut. It was dark and cold, and the air smelled of unwashed wool and fear. Other girls were crying softly around her. A man's voice, rough and low, spoke outside, haggling over prices. Not for livestock. For them. She tried to scream, but her throat was tight with terror. She was a thing, a piece of property. Her name, her family, her home. All of it was being erased by the rumble of the wagon wheels and the finality of a coin changing hands. Clara woke with a gasp. Her own sob caught in her throat. She was drenched in sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs. The room was pitch black. The storm was directly overhead now. Thunder cracking like a whip, and rain lashing against the window. She was alone, utterly, completely alone in the dark, with the ghosts of the past and the terrors of the present closing in. She curled into a ball, wrapping her arms around her knees, and, for the first time in more years than she could count, she cried. She cried for the little girl in the wagon, for the young woman trapped in the saloon, and for the terrifying, foolish hope that the cowboy sleeping out in the storm had just awakened inside of her. The morning after the storm, Calidad was a world of mud. The sky was scrubbed clean and pale, but the street was a thick, brown river of sludge that clung to boots and wagon wheels. The air smelled of wet earth and a false sense of renewal. Nothing had been washed away. Eli knew. The filth in this town ran deeper than the dust. He spent the morning watching, listening, nursing a cup of coffee so bitter it could strip paint. He sat on a bench outside the general store, seeming to do nothing, which in a town like this made him the most suspicious man around. Men loyal to Deacon Kell came and went from the saloon, their faces sullen. 2 of them had fresh bruises blooming on their jaws. They spoke in low rumbles, and Eli, with the patience of a hunter, sifted through their words. He heard talk of a new wagon, a big one with a painted canvas cover depicting smiling dancers. He heard the name of a town south of the border, and he heard the phrase that made the hair on his arms stand up. The Jubilee Traveling Company. It was a flimsy disguise, a name as false as a $3 bill, meant to provide just enough cover to move human cargo without raising alarm. Kell was not just passing girls through. He was preparing a shipment. The thought turned the bitter coffee to acid in Eli's stomach. Inside the saloon, which was quiet and sour in the daylight, Clara was dealing with her own kind of trouble. She had found Susie, the girl from the boarding house, sweeping the floor. Susie was humming, a small, hopeful sound that grated on Clara's raw nerves. The girl's face was still puffy from crying, but her eyes held a determined, dangerous brightness. "Heard you got a job," Clara said, her voice flat. Susie looked up, a shy smile touching her lips. "Mister, Kell was so kind. After what happened last night, he said I was too delicate for this town. He said he's taking me on with his traveling show. I'm to be a singer, like you." The words were a punch to the gut. Clara leaned against the bar, her hands gripping the worn wood. "There is no show, Susie." Susie's smile faltered. "What do you mean? I saw the posters. The Golden Songbird Jubilee? He said we leave in a few days." "It is a lie," Clara said, her voice low and urgent. She glanced around the empty room, but they were alone. "The wagon, the songs, the pretty dresses he promised you. It is all a lie to get you across the border where no one will ever look for you again." The girl's face hardened, her innocence curdling into a stubborn disbelief. "You are just jealous. You are afraid I will be a better singer." "Lord, child, this has nothing to do with singing," Clara whispered, stepping closer. "Look at me. Look at my eyes. Do I look like a woman who is happy here? This is not a job. It is a cage. A pretty cage, maybe, but the door only locks from the outside. Mister, Kel has been a perfect gentleman to me, Susie insisted, her chin trembling. He said you were a troubled woman, that you tell stories. Clara felt a wave of cold despair wash over her. She saw the impenetrable wall of a 16-year-old's dreams. Kel had not just offered a job, he had offered a fantasy, a story where a poor, frightened girl could become a star. Her own bitter truth could not compete with such a beautiful lie. He is not a gentleman, Susie. He is a monster who wears a fancy waistcoat. You leave him alone, Susie snapped, turning her back. And you leave me alone. She began to sweep again, her movements sharp and angry, sending up little clouds of dust that danced in the slivers of morning light. Clara stood there for a long moment, defeated. She had tried. She had spoken the truth, and it had been thrown back in her face. It was always this way. The truth was ugly and sharp-edged. No one ever wanted to hold it. She was walking toward the door when Eli Mercer stepped inside. He nodded at her, his face unreadable. Figured you might be hungry, he said simply. The diner's got biscuits. For a reason she could not name. She followed him. They sat at a small, wobbly table in the corner of the town's only diner. A woman with a tired face brought them plates of biscuits and gravy, and 2 more cups of terrible coffee. They ate in silence for a few minutes. The quiet between them was not empty. It was heavy with the things they had seen the night before. He's planning on moving them, Eli said at last, not looking at her. All of them. Clara pushed a piece of biscuit around her plate. I know. I tried to warn the girl. She thinks I am jealous. A humorless laugh escaped her. Jealous. Eli looked up, his gaze steady. I have a good horse, Buck. He can carry double for a while. And I have enough money to buy you another one in the next town. A fast one. He was not asking. He was offering a fact, a solution as simple and solid as a stone. You could be 50 miles from here by nightfall. Clara stopped pretending to eat. She looked at his hands, calloused and capable, resting on the table. She thought of running. She had been running for more than a decade, running from town to town, from man to man, from one cage to the next. The idea of saddling up a horse and riding until Calidad was just a bad memory was so tempting it made her ache. But then what? Another town, another man like Kel, another lie to tell, another piece of herself to lose. The running never ended. It just changed scenery. No, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Why not? Eli asked, his voice gentle, which was worse than if he had been angry. There is nothing for you here but grief. Because I am tired of running, she said, meeting his eyes. The lie she had told him last night felt like ash in her mouth. The truth was so much heavier. I would rather burn right here in this town than run again. The memory rose in her then, unbidden and sharp, a ghost that was always waiting in the wings. She was 12, and her name was not Clara. It was Annabelle. She had been in the wagon for weeks, sold to a man who ran a trading post deep in the territories. He was not cruel in the way of some men. He was simply indifferent. He treated her like he treated his dog, with a passing pat on the head when he was in a good mood and a sharp word when he was not. He fed her and clothed her, and in return, he expected her to be quiet and useful. But one night, a trapper, half drunk and lonely, had offered her a piece of candy and a kind word. The next day, she had stolen a loaf of bread and a skin of water and run. She had made it almost 2 days. The hope she had felt, running under the big, open sky, was the most painful part of the memory. It had been pure and fierce, a wild thing in her chest. They had caught her by a creek bed, the man from the trading post and the trapper. They had not been indifferent then. The trapper, who had seemed so kind, held her down while the other man used his belt on her bare back. He had not yelled. He had spoken calmly, telling her that this was what happened to ungrateful things. This was what happened when property tried to have a will of its own. When he was done, he had left her there, tied to a tree for the night, for the coyotes and the cold to teach her the rest of the lesson. The pain from the strap was nothing compared to the cold that settled in her soul. It was a deep, internal winter. The hope inside her died. The girl named Annabelle died. The next morning, when he cut her down, she did not cry. She did not speak. She was a hollowed-out thing, numb. That numbness had been her shield ever since. It had kept her alive. But it had also been its own kind of prison. "Clara?" Eli's voice pulled her back to the dusty diner. She blinked, the ghost of the memory receding. "I am not running," she repeated, her voice harder now, the wall back in place. "So you can save your horse." She stood up, threw a coin on the table, and walked out without looking back. Later that afternoon, she saw him. She was mending a tear in her dress by her window, the only place in a room with decent light. Down in the street, a small, grimy-faced boy was struggling with a wagon. One of the wheels had come off its axle, and the boy, no older than 10, was trying to lift the heavy wagon bed by himself, his face red with effort. Men walked past him without a second glance. Then Eli Mercer came out of the livery. He stopped and watched the boy for a moment. He did not rush over. He walked slowly, crouching down so he was at the boy's level. Clara could not hear his words, but she saw him speak, his expression patient. The boy, who had looked angry and defensive, slowly uncurled his fists. Eli pointed at the wheel, then at the axle. He was not doing the work for the boy. He was showing him how. Together, they found a thick piece of timber to use as a lever. Eli showed the boy where to place it for the best purchase. He let the boy put his small weight on the end, and he added his own strength. And together, they lifted the wagon. They slid the wheel back on, hammering the pin into place, the whole time. Eli moved with a quiet, unhurried grace. When they were done, he ruffled the boy's hair. The boy beamed, a proud, gap-toothed smile, and pulled the wagon away. Clara watched Eli walk back toward his camp at the edge of town, and she felt a profound sense of unease. It was his gentleness. It was so foreign, so utterly alien to her experience of men, that it felt like a threat. The men she knew used their strength to break things. Horses, women, the wills of other men. Eli used his to fix a child's broken wagon. The sight of it unsettled her more than any threat, because it suggested a world she had long ago decided did not exist. That night, the threats became more than a suggestion. As she was leaving the saloon after her last song, a man stepped out of the shadows. It was Jarvis, Kel's right hand, a man with a rat-like face and colorless eyes. He blocked her path. "The boss ain't happy. Clara," he said, his voice a greasy whisper. "He don't like new faces in town, especially ones that cause trouble." Clara's hand instinctively moved toward her boot, where the knife was tucked away. "I do not know what you are talking about." Jarvis smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. "Oh, I think you do. Your cowboy friend put his hands on some of our associates. The boss sees that as a business expense, and he's thinking you might be the one to pay for it." He took a step closer, invading her space. "He thinks maybe you've gotten too comfortable here, forgetting your place. He'd hate to have to send you somewhere less comfortable, somewhere they don't care if you can sing or not." The unspoken meaning hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. The cold numbness that was her shield began to crack. She could feel the fear, real and sharp, coiling in her belly. "Tell your boss I am no concern of his," she said, her voice tight. "Everything in this town is his concern." Jarvis sneered. He let his dead eyes roam over her, a look of ownership that made her skin crawl. "Just a friendly warning. Stay away from the cowboy, or you'll both end up as food for the buzzards." He stepped back then, melting into the darkness as suddenly as he had appeared. Clara stood frozen for a full minute, her heart pounding in her ears. She looked at the saloon, at the boarding house, at the whole sleeping, rotten town. There was no safe place. Not anymore. There was only one place she could go. She found him at his camp, a small fire burning against the darkness. He was sitting with his back against his saddle, his rifle across his lap, staring into the flames. He looked up as she approached, his face calm, unsurprised. She could not stop the shaking. It started in her hands and spread through her whole body. She walked into the small circle of firelight and stood before him, unable to speak. He did not say a word. He simply stood, took off his heavy wool coat, and draped it over her shoulders. The coat was warm and smelled of wood smoke, leather, and him. It was a solid, comforting weight. He did not touch her. He did not ask what was wrong. He just stepped back and put another log on the fire, sending a shower of sparks up into the night. She sank to the ground, pulling the coat tighter around her, the shaking slowly subsiding. For a long time, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the lonely cry of a distant coyote. She had to say something. The silence was too full of understanding. She had to push him away, to rebuild the wall he kept dismantling with his quiet kindness. "I am no virgin," she said, the words coming out in a choked whisper. It was the only weapon she had left, the old, tired lie. "Do not treat me like some delicate thing that needs protecting." Eli did not look at her. He kept his eyes on the flames, his profile carved by the firelight. He did not respond. He did not agree or disagree. He did not offer pity or comfort. His silence was a refusal to participate in her lie. He was giving her the dignity of her own pain, allowing her to hold it without trying to fix it or take it away. He just sat there, a few feet away, a solid presence in the vast darkness, and kept watch while she trembled in his coat. In that silence, a dangerous thought took root in Clara's mind. Maybe, just maybe, he already knew she was lying, and maybe, just maybe, he did not care. The thought did not make her feel safe. It made her feel seen, and that was infinitely more terrifying. She started to trust him, and the fear of that trust was a cold knot in her stomach. She was so afraid that if he ever knew the whole truth of her, of what had been done to her, of the girl named Annabelle, he would look at her and see what she saw every time she looked in a mirror, something ruined. The next day, while Clara was sleeping off an exhausted, dreamless slumber in her room, Eli went to the one place in town that was supposed to offer sanctuary. The church was a small, adobe building at the far end of the street, its cross leaning slightly to one side. Inside, it was cool and quiet. An old priest, Father Michael, was sweeping the stone floor. He was a small man with watery eyes and a face etched with a deep, weary guilt. "Can I help you, my son?" the priest asked, his voice soft. "I am not your son," Eli said, but there was no heat in it. "I came to talk about Deacon Kell." The priest stopped sweeping. A flicker of fear crossed his face. "Mister, Kell is a generous benefactor to this parish." "I know what he does," Eli said, his voice low. "He trades in people, girls, children, and you know it too." Father Michael leaned on his broom. He looked old and frail. "There are things a man of God cannot interfere with. The world is full of sin. I can only pray for the souls of those who are lost." "Praying is not going to stop that wagon from crossing the border," Eli countered, stepping closer. "These girls do not need prayers right now. Father, they need a shepherd. They need the church to be a fortress, not a place that looks the other way." The priest's hands trembled. "He would destroy this church. He would burn it to the ground with me inside it. What can one old man do against such evil?" "You can tell the truth," Eli said. "You can stand with those who have no one else to stand for them. You can be what you profess to be." Guilt and fear warred in the old priest's eyes. For a moment, Eli thought he saw a flicker of courage, but then it was gone, extinguished by a lifetime of compromise. "I cannot help you," Father Michael whispered, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I will pray for you, but I cannot help you." Eli looked at the frightened man and the dusty crucifix on the wall behind him. There was no help to be found here, no sanctuary, no justice. He and Clara were utterly on their own. He turned and walked out of the church, back into the merciless glare of the sun. The moon was a sliver of bone in a black sky, offering little light and no comfort. Eli moved through the shadows of Calidad like a ghost, his boots making no sound in the damp earth. The back of the Golden Songbird was quiet, the raucous noise of the saloon a muffled heartbeat through the thick adobe walls. Deacon Kell's private stables stood behind the main building, a long, low structure that was darker and more silent than the rest. It was here, Eli knew, that the real business of the town was conducted. He slipped the simple latch on the stable door and slid inside, pulling it shut behind him. The air was thick with the familiar, honest smells of hay and horseflesh, but underneath it lay a colder, more sinister scent. It was the smell of fear, stale and metallic, a smell that clung to places where people had suffered. A horse shifted in its stall, its soft snort loud in the stillness. Eli murmured a quiet word, his voice a low rumble, and the animal settled. He lit a match, shielding the tiny flame with his cupped hand. The light danced over the stalls. There were 4 fine horses, their coats gleaming. Kell's horses. But Eli was not interested in the animals. He was interested in the large, closed-off section at the far end of the stables, the part with no windows and a heavy, padlocked door. He used the tip of his knife to work the lock. He was no expert, but the mechanism was old and simple. After a few tense minutes of scraping and probing, the lock clicked open. He pushed the door inward and stepped into a room that was colder than the night outside. He lit another match. The small flame revealed the truth he had come seeking. It was a storeroom, but not for feed or tackle. Against one wall were several large, reinforced trunks, their lids shut tight. In the center of the room was a heavy wooden post with iron rings set into it, and on the floor, coiled like sleeping snakes, were chains. They were small, slender chains, not meant for livestock. His heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He saw a pile of discarded cloth in the corner. He knelt, holding the match closer. It was a collection of rags, mostly torn pieces from dresses and shirts. Some of them were stained with dark, rust-colored patches that could only be one thing: blood. He touched one of the rags, the fabric stiff and rough. He thought of his sister, Sarah, and a cold rage, familiar and terrible, rose in his throat. This was not just a waypoint. This was a holding pen, a place where human beings were broken and stored like merchandise before being shipped. A floorboard creaked behind him. Eli was on his feet in an instant, the match dropping from his fingers, plunging the room back into darkness. He drew his Colt, his body coiled to fight. He had been a fool, too focused on what was in front of him. He had not listened for what was behind. "Looks like we got a rat in the grain," a voice sneered from the doorway. A lantern flared to life, blinding him. He saw the silhouettes of 3 men blocking the exit. Jarvis, Kell's rat-faced lieutenant, held the lantern. The other 2 were the same thugs he had dealt with in the alley. Their bruised faces were twisted with grim satisfaction. "The boss is going to be real interested to see you," Jarvis said, a gun appearing in his other hand. Eli did not wait for them to make the next move. He fired, not at Jarvis, but at the lantern he was holding. The shot echoed like a cannon in the enclosed space. The lantern exploded, showering the doorway in burning oil and glass. Jarvis screamed as the flames licked at his coat. Eli used the chaos to charge forward. He slammed his shoulder into one of the thugs, sending the man crashing into the wall. He brought the barrel of his Colt down on the second man's head. The man grunted and staggered back, but there were too many of them, and the space was too tight. A fist caught him in the jaw, snapping his head back. Another blow drove the air from his lungs. He stumbled, his vision swimming. He managed to get one more shot off, the bullet splintering the doorframe, before a heavy boot kicked his gun from his hand. It skittered away into the darkness. Then the beating began. It was brutal and methodical. They were not trying to kill him quickly. They were trying to break him. Fists and boots rained down on him, striking his face, his ribs, his stomach. He tasted blood, hot and coppery. He curled into a ball on the filthy floor, trying to protect his head. But the blows kept coming. Through the haze of pain, he heard Jarvis's voice, raw with fury. "That's enough. The boss wants to talk to him before he dies." Rough hands hauled him to his feet. They dragged him out of the storeroom and into the main part of the stables. He was barely conscious, his body a single, screaming nerve of pain. They propped him against a stall. "Now," Jarvis said, his face illuminated by the burning remnants of his coat, which he had thrown to the ground. "You're going to tell us why you're here. Who sent you?" Eli spat a mouthful of blood onto the hay-strewn floor. He said nothing. Jarvis's face tightened. He backhanded Eli across the face, the force of it cracking a tooth. "Wrong answer." A sudden noise from the far end of the stables made them all turn. A horse whinnied in alarm. One of the thugs went to investigate, disappearing into the shadows. A moment later, there was a heavy thud and a choked gasp. "What was that?" Jarvis snapped. Before the remaining thug could move, a shape darted out of the darkness. It was Clara. In her hand, she held a heavy iron skillet from the saloon's kitchen. She swung it with all her might, connecting with the side of the man's head. He collapsed without a sound. Jarvis stared at her, his mouth agape in disbelief. That second of hesitation was all Eli needed. He surged forward, ignoring the fire in his ribs, and tackled Jarvis, driving him back into a pile of hay. They wrestled for a moment, a desperate, clumsy struggle. Eli was bigger, but his body was failing him. Jarvis was wiry and quick. He managed to land a solid punch on Eli's already battered face. Then Clara was there again. She brought the skillet down hard on Jarvis's arm. He screamed as the bone gave way. Eli scrambled away as Clara stood over the writhing man, her face a mask of terror and fury. The skillet held high, ready to strike again. "Go!" she hissed at Eli. "Get out of here, now!" He staggered to his feet, every muscle screaming in protest. He could barely stand. "Clara!" "Go!" she insisted, her eyes wild. She looked from him to the men on the ground. "They will kill you! They will kill us both! Get out of Calidad!" But he knew he could not make it 10 feet, let alone out of town. He leaned against the wall, his vision tunneling to a small, dark point. He saw her face, pale and frightened, before the world dissolved into blackness. When he came to, he was no longer in the stables. He was in a small, cramped room, and the scent of lavender and lye soap had replaced the stench of blood and hay. He was lying on a narrow cot. A single candle flickered on a small table, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He tried to sit up, and a bolt of agony shot through his side, forcing him back down with a groan. "Be still," a soft voice commanded. Clara was sitting on a stool beside the bed. A basin of water was on the floor, the water pinkish in the candlelight. She held a damp cloth in her hand. Her face was grim, her brow furrowed with concentration as she gently dabbed at a cut on his forehead. "Where are we?" he rasped, his throat raw. "My room," she said, not looking at him. "Above the saloon. It is the last place they will think to look for you." He looked around. The room was sparse, a small bed, a washstand, a single wooden chair, and a rickety wardrobe. A faded calico dress hung on a peg on the wall. It was a room that offered no comfort, a place for sleeping, not for living. And she had brought him here, to her only private space, her only sanctuary. The risk she was taking was enormous. "You should not have done this," he said. She finally looked at him, her stormy eyes flashing with anger. "And what was I supposed to do? Leave you in the dirt for them to finish? You are a fool, Eli Mercer, a stubborn, righteous fool." She dipped the cloth back into the water and began to clean a deep gash on his cheek. Her touch was surprisingly gentle, her movements careful and precise. He watched her, the flickering candlelight softening the hard lines of her face. He saw the tremor in her hands, the exhaustion in the slump of her shoulders. She was terrified, but she was here. She had come back for him. They were silent for a long time as she worked, cleaning his cuts, her brow knitted in concentration. The only sounds were the soft splash of the cloth in the water, the distant, muffled music from the saloon below, and the ragged sound of his own breathing. The small room felt charged with an unspoken intimacy. He was closer to her now than he had ever been to another living soul, his broken body entirely at her mercy. He could feel the warmth of her neared, smell the faint scent of soap and sweat on her skin. He saw the way her gaze lingered on the crude, faded tattoo on his forearm, a single, stylized letters, Sarah. She did not ask about it, she just looked, and in her eyes, he saw a flicker of understanding, a shared knowledge of loss. When she had finished cleaning the cuts on his face, she hesitated. "Your shirt," she said, her voice low. "I need to see to your ribs." He nodded, and with slow, painful movements, he unbuttoned the blood-soaked fabric. She helped him ease it off his shoulders. Her breath hitched when she saw the dark, ugly bruises already purpling across his chest and abdomen. She reached out a tentative hand and gently prodded the area around his ribs. He flinched, sucking in a sharp breath. "At least one is broken," she diagnosed, her voice clinical, as if distancing herself from the reality of his pain. She began to wrap his torso with strips of clean linen she had torn from a sheet. As she leaned over him, her hair, which had come loose from its pins, brushed against his cheek. He felt her tremble, the closeness, the vulnerability, the shared danger. It had created a current between them that was powerful and terrifying. When she finished wrapping his ribs, she did not move away. She stayed there, her hands resting on his chest, her face just inches from his. He saw the conflict in her eyes, a maelstrom of fear, confusion, and a desperate, heartbreaking resignation. She looked at him, at his broken body, and he saw her come to a conclusion. It was the only conclusion her life had ever taught her. A debt had been incurred. She had saved his life. He was a man, and she knew what men expected as payment. With a deep, shuddering breath, she straightened up. Her hands, still trembling, went to the top button of her own simple blouse. She undid it, then the next one. Her eyes never left his, but they were distant, glassy, as if she had retreated to that cold, numb place inside herself. Eli's heart broke. He understood in that instant what she was doing. It was not a seduction. It was a transaction. It was the only currency she had ever been allowed to possess. He reached up, his own hand shaking with pain and emotion, and gently covered hers, stopping her fingers from unfastening the third button. She flinched, her eyes clouding with confusion and a flicker of fear. Was he rejecting her? Was she not enough? "Clara," he said, his voice a raw whisper. He held her gaze, pouring every ounce of sincerity he possessed into his words. "You do not owe me anything." The words hung in the small, silent room. They were simple words, but for Clara, they were a cataclysm. They struck the foundations of her world, shattering the grim logic that had governed her every interaction with men for the past 10 years. "You do not owe me anything." It was a statement of such profound and impossible kindness that her mind could not process it. She stared at him, her face slack with shock, and then something inside her, some dam she had built stone by painful stone since she was a 12-year-old girl tied to a tree, finally broke. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Then another. A choked sob escaped her lips. She tried to stifle it, to push it back down, but it was no use. The grief was a flood, unstoppable and overwhelming. She sank down onto the stool, covering her face with her hands. and began to weep. She did not cry for the pain or the fear. She cried because, for the first time in her life, a man had looked at her not as something to be taken, but as someone to be respected. She cried because his gentleness was a more devastating blow than any man's cruelty had ever been. Eli watched her, his own eyes burning. He did not touch her. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He just stayed there, present and still, and let her grieve for the years that had been stolen from her. He gave her the gift of his quiet, unwavering witness. It was almost dawn when her tears subsided, leaving her exhausted and hollowed out, but strangely lighter. The storm inside her had passed. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. The walls were down. There was no point in hiding anymore. "My name is not Clara," she said, her voice raspy. "It is Annabelle. I was born in Kansas, on a farm near the Cimarron River." She told him everything then. The kidnapping, the wagon, the trading post, the years of being passed from one man to another, a piece of property with no name and no past. She spoke in a low, flat monotone, as if recounting the story of a stranger. When she was finished, the silence returned. But it was different now. It was filled with the weight of her truth. Eli listened to it all without interruption. When she fell silent, he finally spoke, his own voice thick with an old, unhealed sorrow. "My sister's name was Sarah," he said quietly. "She was 15, bright as a new penny and stubborn as a mule." He told her how their parents had died of fever, leaving him to raise her, how a smooth-talking man had come through their town, promising Sarah a good job as a seamstress in St. Louis, how she had gone with him, full of dreams. "I got a letter a month later," Eli continued, his eyes fixed on some distant, painful memory. "Not from her, from a doctor at a charity hospital. She was sick. By the time I got there, it was too late. The man had sold her. She died from neglect, from a broken heart as much as any fever." He closed his eyes. "I buried her, and I started writing. I have spent every year since then trying to find the men who did it, and trying to save any other girl I find in a place like she was. So she did not die for nothing." He opened his eyes and looked at Annabelle, her real name, the name of the girl who had survived. "I am not some hero, Annabelle. I am just a man trying to pay a debt to a ghost." In that small, candlelit room, two broken people shared their truths and found, not pity, but a profound and binding recognition in each other's pain. They were no longer a stranger and a saloon girl. They were Eli and Annabelle, and they were facing the same monster. "He is going to kill you," she said, her voice gaining a new strength. "As soon as he finds out you are still here, he will tear this town apart to find you." "I am not leaving," Eli said. "Not while he still has those girls." "Then we have to fight him," she said, a fierce light coming into her eyes. "Not with fists, not with guns. We have to be smarter." A plan began to form between them, born of desperation and a shared, burning desire for justice. It was a wild, dangerous plan, with 1,000 ways it could go wrong. "First, we need to get you out," Eli said. "But if you just disappear, he will hunt you forever." "So I cannot just disappear," she finished, understanding dawning on her face. "I have to die." He nodded. "We will make it look like an accident, a fire, something that leaves nothing behind." He looked at her, his expression grim. "Then, while Kel is counting his losses, we get the others out. We free them." "And Kel?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Eli's jaw tightened. "We burn his whole filthy operation to the ground." The days that followed were a blur of stolen moments and whispered plans, a fragile conspiracy held together in the suffocating confines of Clara's tiny room. While Eli healed, his body a map of angry bruises, Clara became his eyes and ears. She played her part in the saloon with a chilling perfection, singing her sad songs, smiling her empty smiles. But now, behind the performance, there was a new and dangerous purpose. Her target was Jarvis, Kell's lieutenant. He was a vain, cruel man who preened under the attention of the saloon's most beautiful woman, Clara. Now Annabelle, in her own mind, used his vanity like a key. She began to seek him out, bringing him a glass of his preferred whiskey, laughing at his crude jokes, letting her hand linger on his arm for a fraction of a second too long. Each touch was a violation that made her skin crawl, a bitter echo of a past she was trying to destroy. But she endured it, her mind a cold, calculating machine. She was not the trembling girl in Eli's arms anymore. She was a hunter. One night, she found Jarvis in Kell's back office, counting the night's take. She leaned in the doorway, a bottle of whiskey in her hand. "A long night, Mr. Jarvis," she said, her voice a low purr. He looked up, his rat-like eyes gleaming with surprise and pleasure. "Clara, come in. Help a man forget his troubles." She poured him a drink, then another. She listened to him boast about Kell's plans, about the money they would make from the Jubilee. She learned that the girls were being kept in a locked room in the boarding house next door, guarded day and night. While he was distracted, his words slurring from the drink, her eyes scanned the room. She saw a large ring of keys hanging on a hook by the door. Beside them, pinned to a board, was a crudely drawn map of the boarding house, with one room circled in red, the floor plans. "You look tense," she murmured, stepping behind his chair. She began to knead his shoulders, her touch firm. He grunted with pleasure, leaning his head back. As his eyes closed, her hand, swift and silent as a snake, darted out and lifted the heavy ring of keys from the hook. She slipped them into the deep pocket of her apron. Her other hand moved just as quickly, plucking the pin from the map and sliding the rolled-up paper into her sleeve. "That is better," he slurred, reaching a clumsy hand for her. She danced away, a practiced, regretful smile on her face. "Not here, Mr. Jarvis. The boss would have my hide." She gave him a look that was a promise and a lie. "Perhaps tomorrow?" She backed out of the room, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, the cold, heavy weight of the keys a triumph in her pocket. While Annabelle walked among the wolves, Eli, still moving with the stiff gait of a man held together by sheer will, moved among the town's forgotten men. He could not fight Kell's crew alone. He needed an army, however small. He started at the blacksmith's forge. The smith, a mountain of a man named Samuel, whose arms were thick as tree limbs, had a face set in a permanent scowl of grief. "I have no fight left in me," Samuel said, not looking up from the horseshoe he was hammering. "I heard you had a daughter," Eli said quietly. The hammer fell silent. The big man's shoulders slumped. "Rosalie, she was 17. Took a job as a maid at the boarding house last year. One day, she was just gone." He looked at Eli, his eyes hollow. "The sheriff said she ran off with a drifter. I know he lied. I know Kell took her. He is getting ready to take more." Eli said, "A wagon leaves in 2 days. We can stop it." Samuel stared into the glowing heart of his forge, then at his own powerful hands. "What do you need?" he asked, his voice a low growl. Eli found his next ally in a dusty corner of the livery stable, oiling a rifle that had not been fired in years. Jedediah Hollis had been the sheriff of Calidad before the man with the drooping mustache, before he had tried to arrest one of Deacon Kell's men for murder and been run out of his own office. "Kell owns this town, Mercer," Hollis said, his voice rusty with disuse. "You cannot fight a man who owns the law." "We are not fighting the law," Eli corrected. "We are fighting him. You know this town. You know its weaknesses. You know the men who hate him but are too scared to act." Hollis spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. He looked at his old badge, which he kept in a tarnished box. "He made me a coward. I have lived with that shame every day." He looked up at Eli, a flicker of the man he used to be returning to his eyes. "It is about time I earned my name back." Hollis led him to the last of their recruits, 2 Russian immigrant brothers, Anton and Dmitry Petrov. They ran a small freight business that Kel had systematically choked out, stealing their contracts and threatening their customers. They were proud, stubborn men with nothing left to lose. They listened to Eli's plan, their faces grim. And when he was done, the older brother, Anton, spoke for them both. "This man, Kel," he said in his thick accent, "he is a devil. We will help you send him back to hell." They were 4 men and 1 woman against an army of paid guns. But for the first time since riding into Calidad, Eli felt a sliver of hope. The night before the escape, a nervous energy crackled in the air. The plan was set. Samuel would create a diversion, a fire, in an old, abandoned shed on the far side of town. While Kel's men were drawn to the flames, Eli and the others would storm the boarding house, free the girls, and get them to the horses they had hidden in a dry arroyo miles away. Annabelle's role was the most dangerous. She was to set a fire in her own room, a signal that the escape was on, and the final proof of Clara's tragic death. Eli was in her room, checking the pistol he had taken from one of Kel's men. Annabelle was pacing the small space like a caged animal. The fear she had kept at bay for days was returning, a cold tide rising in her chest. She stopped and looked at him, his face battered and bruised in the candlelight, his expression grim with determination. "This is a mistake," she whispered, her voice trembling. Eli looked up. "It is too late for doubts. Annabelle." "No, you do not understand," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. The old, familiar shame was closing in on her, whispering its poison in her ear. "What if we do this, and some of them get away? What if some of them do not? What happens to them then? What happens to me?" She sank onto the edge of the bed, her body shaking. "I am not worth all this. Eli, I am not worth you getting killed. I am not worth any of it." Her voice dropped so low he could barely hear it. "He broke me, years ago. That man at the trading post, he broke me into 1,000 pieces. There is nothing left inside me to save. My soul is too ruined." Eli put the gun down and went to her. He knelt before her, so their eyes were level. He saw the raw, terrifying vulnerability on her face, the self-loathing that had been her constant companion for a decade. He did not offer platitudes or false reassurances. He simply reached out and took her trembling hands in his. "You are not broken," he said, his voice low and steady, a rock in the storm of her despair. He held her gaze, forcing her to see the truth in his eyes. "You are still here." The words, so simple, so absolute, pierced through the layers of her shame. "You are still here." It was not a compliment. It was a fact. She had survived the wagon, the beatings, the years of being an object. She had endured. She had not shattered. She was still here. He gently squeezed her hands. "You are the strongest person I have ever known. Annabelle." A sob escaped her, a sound of pain and release. He stood and pulled her to her feet, wrapping his arms around her. She collapsed against him, her body shaking with the force of her weeping. He held her, his hand stroking her hair, his presence a solid, unshakable comfort. She was not a burden. She was not a delicate thing. She was a survivor. When her tears finally subsided, she leaned back, her hands still resting on his chest. She looked up at his face, at the kindness in his eyes, a kindness she was finally beginning to believe she deserved. The space between them was electric, charged with all the unspoken words, all the shared pain. He lowered his head, slowly, giving her time to pull away. She did not. She rose on her toes to meet him. The kiss was not rushed or rough. It was not born of passion or of lust. It was slow and warm and trembling, a quiet affirmation in the face of a brutal world. It tasted of salt from her tears and of a desperate, burgeoning hope. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his bruised jaw. In that moment, in the safety of his arms, she finally, truly believed that she could be wanted without being used, that she could be touched without being taken. The fire in the shed went up with a whoosh, painting the night sky orange. Shouts erupted from the saloon as Kel's men rushed toward the flames. It was the signal. Annabelle took a deep breath, her heart hammering. She looked around her small room one last time. She knocked over the candle, letting the flame catch on the threadbare curtains. Then she slipped out the door and ran for the boarding house. Eli, Hollis, and the Petrov brothers moved through the shadows, their face set and grim. They reached the back door of the boarding house just as Annabelle arrived. She produced the key, her hand shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get it into the lock. The door swung open into a dark hallway. They could hear the whimpers of frightened girls from a room at the end of the hall. Hollis and the brothers stood guard while Eli and Annabelle moved toward the room. Another key from the ring slid into the lock. Eli pushed the door open. There were 6 of them, huddled together in the corner of the dark, airless room. The youngest could not have been more than 13. Their faces were pale with terror. Susie, the girl Annabelle had tried to warn, was among them. When she saw Annabelle, her eyes widened in shock. "Quickly," Eli said, his voice a low, urgent command. "There is no time." He started to usher them out, but one of the younger girls, her nerves stretched to the breaking point, took one look at the strange, bruised men in the hallway and let out a piercing scream. It was the sound that doomed them. From the front of the boarding house, a man shouted. Heavy footsteps pounded toward them. "They are in the back!" "Go!" Eli yelled, pushing Annabelle and the girls toward the back door. "Get them to the horses. I will hold them off." He turned, his pistol raised. Just as 2 of Kel's men rounded the corner, he fired, and one of the men went down, clutching his leg. The other returned fire, the bullet splintering the wall next to Eli's head. The escape had devolved into chaos. Annabelle pushed the terrified, crying girls out into the night. "Run!" she screamed. "To the stables! Go!" Most of them scattered into the darkness, their fear giving them speed. The shootout in the boarding house spilled out into the alley. Gunshots echoed through the town, a brutal counterpoint to the distant crackle of the diversionary fire. Eli used the corner of the building as cover, exchanging shots with the men who were now pouring out of the saloon. He saw Hollis go down, a dark stain spreading on his shirt. The Petrov brothers laid down covering fire, their faces grim. Eli felt a searing, white-hot pain in his shoulder. He staggered back, his arm going numb. The pistol fell from his nerveless fingers. He was hit. He slumped against the wall, his vision blurring at the edges. Through the haze of smoke and pain, he saw Annabelle. She had not run, while the other girls had fled. She had stayed, her face a mask of terror. She saw him fall. For a split second, he saw the old fear in her eyes, the instinct to flee, to save herself. Then it was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective fury. She ran to him, ignoring the bullets that whizzed past her. She grabbed him under his good arm, her small frame straining with his weight. "No!" she grunted, pulling him toward a stack of crates at the end of the alley. "You are not dying here." She managed to drag him behind the flimsy cover. Gunfire ripped through the wood around them. She pushed him down, shielding his body with her own. She took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. It was cold and trembling, but it was there. "Do not die, Eli," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "Please, do not die." He looked at her face illuminated by the muzzle flashes, and saw not Clara the saloon singer, not Annabelle the victim, but a warrior. The sound of hoofbeats thundered nearby. Dmitri Petrov appeared, leading 2 horses. "Come!" he yelled. "We must go now." Most of the girls had made it to the main stables and had taken horses. Scattering into the desert, their escape was a chaotic success, but the cost was high. Annabelle, with Dmitri's help, hauled Eli onto one of the horses. She scrambled up behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist to hold him in the saddle. They galloped out of the alley and into the open, leaving the sounds of the gunfight and the burning town behind them. They rode hard for what felt like hours, the dark, unforgiving landscape of the New Mexico desert stretching out around them. Eli drifted in and out of consciousness, his head lolling against her shoulder. The pain in his shoulder was a constant, throbbing fire. Just before dawn, as a cold, steady rain began to fall, they saw it, a dark shape against the gray horizon. An abandoned church, its roof partially collapsed, its bell tower a lonely finger pointing at the sky. It was a ruin, a place forsaken by God and man. It was the perfect place to hide. They half-carried, half-dragged Eli inside, out of the driving rain. They laid him on the cold stone floor near the crumbling altar. Water dripped through the holes in the roof, forming puddles on the ground. Eli shivered, his teeth chattering, his face pale and slick with rain and sweat. Annabelle knelt beside him, holding his hand, her heart a cold, hard knot of fear. They had escaped, but she was terrified their freedom would be bought with his life. The abandoned church was a tomb of cold stone and dripping water. For 2 days, the rain was relentless, a gray sheet that cut them off from the world and trapped them in a twilight of pain and fear. Annabelle moved like a wraith in the gloom, her face pale and smudged with dirt. She had torn strips from her own petticoat to use as bandages and kept a constant, smoky fire going with damp wood scavenged from the collapsed vestry. The fire was their only source of warmth, a defiant little heart of light in the cavernous, decaying nave. Eli was lost in the fever. He burned with an inner fire that had nothing to do with the hearth, his body racked with shivers that made his teeth chatter. He thrashed on the bed of old grain sacks she had made for him, his mind caught in a nightmare landscape of the past. He spoke, his voice a dry, broken rasp, the words tumbling out in a torrent of guilt. "Should have been there. Sarah," he mumbled, his eyes squeezed shut. Seeing a ghost, she could not. "Told you not to go. He was a snake. I saw it, and I did nothing." Annabelle knelt beside him, wiping his brow with a cool, damp cloth. She had heard him say the name before. Sarah, the sister, the ghost who rode with him. "Hush now, Eli," she whispered, her voice a soothing murmur. "You are safe." But he was beyond her comfort, trapped in the prison of his own memory. "So much blood on my hands," he gasped, his body arching in a spasm of pain. "The men I have hurt, the men I have killed, trying to wash it clean, but it never comes clean. I never feel clean." He turned his head on the makeshift pillow, a single tear cutting a path through the grime on his temple. "I am sorry. Sarah, I am so sorry." His confession, raw and ripped from the depths of his delirium, settled in the quiet church. Annabelle listened to the agony of this good, quiet man, and she felt the last of her own defenses crumble. He had seen the truth of her, and he had not flinched. Now, she was seeing the truth of him, not a fearless avenger, but a man drowning in grief, who fought the world's darkness because he could not extinguish the darkness inside himself. She took his hand, his skin blazing hot beneath her cool fingers. His tormented thrashing stilled at her touch. His breathing, though still ragged, seemed to ease. She held on, a silent anchor in his storm-tossed mind. The fever broke on the 3rd day. The rain stopped, and a weak, watery sunlight filtered through the broken stained glass windows, painting fractured jewels of color on the stone floor. Eli woke, his mind clear for the first time in days. He was weak, his shoulder a universe of dull, throbbing pain, but the fire was gone. He saw Annabelle asleep in a chair near the fire, her head slumped at an uncomfortable angle, her face etched with exhaustion. He saw the basin of water, the discarded, bloodied bandages. He knew she had not slept. She had stayed with him. She had pulled him back from the edge. Later, as she was helping him drink some water, Her expression was guarded, as if she were afraid of what he might remember from the fever. He looked at her, his gaze steady. "Thank you," he said, his voice weak but clear. She just nodded, unable to meet his eyes. The weight of his fevered confessions hung in the air between them. She was the one who broke the silence. She sat on the edge of his makeshift bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "When I was in the saloon," she began, her voice low and steady, "I told you I was no virgin." She finally looked at him, her eyes full of a sorrow so deep it seemed ancient. "I lied because I was ashamed, because that is what they do to you. They take everything, and then they make you feel ashamed for what you have lost." Her voice trembled, but she did not stop. "They make you feel ruined, unclean. I thought if I said the words myself, if I owned the lie, it could not be used as a weapon against me. But it was a weapon I was using against myself." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "I do not want to lie to you anymore. Eli." He reached out his good hand and covered hers. He said nothing. He did not have to. In his touch, in the quiet understanding in his eyes, she felt an absolution that no priest could ever have given her. She felt clean. Their fragile peace was shattered 2 days later. Dmitri Petrov, the younger of the two Russian brothers, appeared at the church door like a ghost, his face grim. He had ridden to a small settlement 30 miles south to get supplies and news. "Kel is like a rabid dog," Dmitri reported, his voice a low rumble. "He lost his prize stock, and his business is in ashes. He has put a price on all your heads." "On the girls. And a bigger one on yours. Mercer." He looked at Eli. "He has hired bounty hunters, not saloon thugs, real trackers. They are already scouring the territory." The news settled like a shroud over the small church. The world was coming for them. But Dmitri had more news, a sliver of light in the encroaching darkness. "It is not all bad," he said, a rare smile touching his lips. "The girls, they are not just hiding, they are talking." He pulled a folded, slightly damp newspaper from his coat. The headline was stark: "Whispers of a white slavery ring on the New Mexico border." One of them, a girl named Susie, found her way to a preacher in Dusty Creek. Dmitri explained. She told him everything. He contacted the paper. Others are telling their stories. 2. People are starting to listen. The sheriffs in the other counties are being forced to ask questions. Your fire, my friends, it has started a much bigger one. For a moment, hope, fierce and bright, burned in the ruined church. They were not alone. The girls' voices, once silenced, were becoming a chorus, a testament to the truth that could no longer be buried. But the bounty hunters were still out there, a more immediate and deadly threat. Dmitri left them with a rifle and a small portion of the supplies, promising to return when he could. That night, the reality of their situation pressed in on them. They were fugitives, living on borrowed time. The vast, empty desert that had been their sanctuary now felt like a closing trap. Eli was stronger. He could walk without stumbling, and the pain in his shoulder had subsided to a manageable ache. He sat by the fire, cleaning the rifle Dmitri had brought, his movements economical and precise. Annabelle watched him, her heart a tangle of fear and a feeling so new and tender she did not dare give it a name. She went to him, sitting on the floor beside him. The firelight danced on their faces, casting the rest of the church into deep shadow. The silence was comfortable now, a shared language. They had seen the worst of each other, the deepest wounds, and they were still here, together. She reached out and gently touched the side of his face, her fingers tracing the faded bruise on his cheekbone. He stopped his work and turned to her, his gaze soft and questioning. In that moment, the world shrank to the small space between them. There were no bounty hunters, no Deacon Kell, no ghosts of the past. There was only the firelight and the quiet rhythm of their breathing. It was her choice. For the first time in her life, she was not reacting, not surviving, not paying a debt. She was choosing. She leaned in and kissed him. A slow, gentle kiss that was not a demand but an offering. He responded in kind, his hand coming up to cup the back of her neck, his touch infinitely tender. It was a kiss of profound and aching gratitude, a silent acknowledgement of the trust they had forged in the crucible of violence and fear. Later, they lay together on the bed of sacks, his good arm holding her close. It was not the desperate, clumsy fumbling she had known. It was a slow, deliberate exploration, a relearning of what it meant to be touched with reverence instead of rage. His hands were patient. His whispers were reassurances. It was an act of healing, of reclaiming the parts of herself that had been stolen. It was about the quiet intimacy of lying in the dark, safe in another's arms, and knowing that for this one night, you were not alone. It was not about sex. It was about trust made manifest. In the ruins of a church, surrounded by danger, Annabelle finally felt saved. But the dawn, as it always does, brought the world rushing back. When she woke, he was already up, dressed, and strapping on his gun belt. The rifle leaned against the wall by the door. His horse was saddled. A cold dread seized her. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice tight with sleep and fear. He turned, his face grim, but his eyes soft. "They are hunting for us, Annabelle. For all of us. As long as we are together, you are a target." "So we leave," she said, getting to her feet, pulling a blanket around her shoulders. "We ride south. We can make it to Mexico." He shook his head. "They are trackers. They will find us. They will follow our trail until the ends of the earth." He walked to her and took her hands. "There is only one way. I have to lead them away. Make them follow me. Give you and the others time to disappear for good." The floor seemed to drop out from under her. After everything they had been through, after the hope she had allowed herself to feel, he was going to leave. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, Eli. You cannot. You will not survive." "I am hard to kill," he said with a sad, crooked smile. "I will not let you," she insisted, her grip on his hands tightening. The thought of being alone again was a physical pain. She had just found him. She could not lose him. She had spent her whole life being brave by herself. She did not know if she had the strength to do it anymore. "I do not want to be brave without you." Her words struck him with more force than any bullet. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. He buried his face in her hair. "Then do not be," he whispered against her ear, his voice thick with an emotion he could not hide. He pulled back, his hands framing her face, and kissed her. A deep, desperate kiss that was both a promise and a goodbye. "Let me be brave for you." He released her before she could say another word and walked to the door. He picked up the rifle and turned to look at her one last time, his heart in his eyes. Then he was gone. She ran to the doorway and watched as he mounted his horse and rode away. A solitary figure against the rising sun, heading not south toward safety, but north, back toward the danger. Eli rode for hours, his body aching but his mind sharp. He pushed his horse hard, leaving a clear, deliberate trail for any tracker to follow. He was heading for a place he knew, a narrow box canyon a day's ride from the church. It was a natural trap, with high walls and only one way in or out. He would find a high perch, a sniper's nest, and he would wait. He would let them come to him. By late afternoon, he reached the canyon's mouth. The towering red rock walls rose on either side, casting long, cool shadows. The air was still and silent. He dismounted, leading Buck into the narrow passage, his rifle held ready. He was the bait, and he was setting the trap. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who knew the land and knew his enemy. He rounded a sharp bend in the canyon, his eyes scanning the cliffs above for the perfect vantage point. He was so focused on the trap he was setting that he did not see the trap that was already set for him. A glint of sunlight off a rifle barrel, high above and to his right. He reacted instantly, diving for cover, but it was too late. A voice, calm and cold, echoed off the canyon walls. It was not Jarvis. It was not Deacon Kell. It was a voice he did not recognize. "That is far enough. Mercer—" More shapes appeared on the cliffs around him. 4 of them. 5. He was surrounded. This was not the clumsy ambush of saloon thugs. This was professional. A trap had been waiting, but it was not his. He had ridden right into theirs. There was no honor among the men who captured Eli. They were not Kell's brutish thugs, but something far more dangerous, patient, methodical hunters of men, their faces weathered and unreadable, their eyes as cold and empty as the desert sky. They dragged him from the canyon, tied his hands, and threw him over his own horse, leading him to a desolate camp in a rocky basin, a place where a man's screams would be swallowed by the wind. Deacon Kell was waiting for him. He was no longer the slick, smiling saloon owner. The fancy waistcoat was gone, replaced by a simple shirt stained with sweat and fury. The civilized mask had been torn away, and the thing underneath was ugly and rabid. They tied Eli to the spare wheel of a wagon, his feet barely touching the ground, his wounded shoulders screaming with every jostle. Kell circled him like a vulture. "You have caused me a great deal of trouble, Mr. Mercer," Kell said, his voice deceptively calm. "You have cost me a small fortune, and you have scattered my property to the 4 winds." He stopped in front of Eli, his eyes boring into him. "So you are going to tell me where they are? Which towns, which settlements, which rat holes they have crawled into? And then, perhaps, I will grant you a quick death." Eli's head hung low, his matted hair obscuring his face. He said nothing. Kell sighed, a theatrical sound of disappointment. He nodded to one of the bounty hunters. The man stepped forward and drove his fist into Eli's already broken ribs. A galaxy of white-hot pain exploded behind Eli's eyes, and a groan escaped his lips, but he remained silent. "I can do this all night," Kell said pleasantly, "and all day tomorrow. But you will talk. They always talk." They were skilled in their cruelty. They used no whips or knives, just their fists and boots and a methodical, soul-crushing patience. They worked on him for hours. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the desert grew cold, they targeted his wounds, the burning agony in his shoulder, the deep bruises on his torso. Through it all, Eli's mind retreated to a small, hard place deep inside himself. He thought of Sarah. He thought of the promise he had made to her ghost. And he thought of Annabelle's face in the firelight, her eyes finally clear of fear. His silence was the only shield he could offer them now. He lost track of time. Pain became the only reality. But he did not speak. Finally, Kell, his patience worn to a thread, grabbed a handful of Eli's hair and yanked his head up, forcing Eli to look at him. "You are a stubborn man," he hissed, his face inches away. "Fine. If you will not talk to save yourself, perhaps you will talk to save her." A cold dread, sharper and more terrifying than any physical pain, cut through Eli's haze. "The saloon singer," Kell continued, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Clara, or whatever her name is, my man Jarvis had quite a fondness for her before she broke his arm. When I find her, and I will find her, I will not be as gentle as he was. I will take my time. I will take what I am owed for all this trouble, and then I will pass her to my men, and when they are done, I will sell what is left of her to the filthiest cantina in Sonora. She will pray for a death that will never come." Kell's words were a poison that seeped into the small, hard place where Eli had hidden his resolve. He saw it. He saw Annabelle's face, the trust she had placed in him, the fragile hope he had seen reborn in her eyes. He saw Kell's men putting their hands on her, tearing that hope apart, dragging her back into the darkness she had just escaped. The thought was a torment worse than any physical blow. His shield shattered. His promise to a ghost was nothing compared to the desperate, urgent need to protect the living, breathing woman he loved. He could not let that happen. He could not. A broken, ragged sound tore from his throat. "All right," he croaked, the word tasting like ash and surrender. "I will tell you." Kel's smile was triumphant. "I thought you might. Now, where are they?" Eli took a gasping breath, the words of betrayal forming on his tongue. Just as he was about to speak, a low whistle echoed from the rocks above the camp. One of the bounty hunters looked up, his hand going to his gun. "What was that?" Before anyone could react, a voice, clear and strong, rang out from the darkness. A woman's voice. "Deacon Kell!" Every man in the camp froze. Kell spun around, his face a mask of disbelief. Eli lifted his head, his heart pounding. He knew that voice. "Show yourself!" Kell bellowed into the night. A figure appeared on the ridge overlooking the camp. It was a woman in a simple, homespun dress and bonnet, the very picture of a plain settler's wife. In her hands, she held a lit stick of dynamite. It was Annabelle. "Let him go," she commanded, her voice steady, betraying none of the terror she must have felt. Kell stared for a second, then threw back his head and laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You? You in what army?" On cue, two more figures appeared on the ridge. One was the hulking shape of Samuel the blacksmith, holding a rifle that looked like a toy in his massive hands. The other was Dmitri Petrov, his face grim, a shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. Kell's laughter died in his throat, his face contorted with rage. "Kill them!" he screamed at the bounty hunters. But Annabelle was already moving. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed the stick of dynamite not into the camp, but onto a narrow ledge halfway down the rock face. The bounty hunters raised their rifles, but it was too late. The explosion was deafening, a titanic roar that shook the very ground. Tons of rock and earth, loosened by the blast, cascaded down, sealing the narrow entrance to the basin. They were trapped. In the ensuing chaos of dust and confusion, Samuel and Dmitri opened fire from above, their shots pinning the bounty hunters down. Annabelle, meanwhile, had disappeared from the ridge. A moment later, she emerged from the shadows at the edge of the camp, a pistol in her hand. She had circled around while they were distracted. She ran straight for Eli, her face a mask of fierce determination. She used a knife she had tucked in her belt to saw through the ropes binding his wrists. He collapsed to the ground, his legs unable to hold him. "I told you not to die," she said, her voice choked with tears and adrenaline as she helped him to his feet. Kell, recovering from the shock, saw them. With a roar of fury, he raised his own pistol and fired. The bullet whizzed past Annabelle's head, so close she felt the heat of it. Eli shoved her behind the wagon and picked up a gun dropped by one of the bounty hunters. He was weak, his vision swimming, but a last reserve of strength flowed through him. He would not let this man harm her. The basin became a maelstrom of gunfire. Samuel and Dmitri provided cover from above, their shots echoing in the enclosed space. Eli, using the wagon for cover, exchanged fire with Kell and the remaining hunters. It was a desperate, hopeless fight. They were still outnumbered. Then, from the new passage blown open by the dynamite, another shot rang out. It was not from a rifle or a pistol. It was the deep, satisfying boom of a shotgun. Jedediah Hollis, the old sheriff, stepped into the basin, his face set, his shotgun smoking. He was not alone. Behind him were a dozen men from Caledad, shopkeepers, ranchers, old prospectors, their faces grim, their hands holding whatever weapons they could find. The town's silence had finally broken. The bounty hunters, seeing themselves completely surrounded, threw down their weapons. They were professionals, not fanatics. They did not die for a lost cause. Only Kell was left. He stood alone, his face pale with disbelief and rage, his pistol empty. He looked around at the ring of hostile faces, the men he had terrorized, the town he had owned. He saw Eli and Annabelle step out from behind the wagon, his eyes, full of hate, locked on her. "You," he snarled. "You were nothing. A piece of merchandise." Before anyone else could move, a figure pushed through the crowd of townsmen. It was Susie, the girl who had been groomed for the Jubilee. Her face was no longer that of a frightened child. It was hard and old. In her hands, she held a rifle, and she held it with a steadiness that was terrifying to behold. She did not say a word. She simply raised the rifle, sighted down the barrel, and pulled the trigger. The shot was clean and true. Deacon Kell staggered back, a look of profound surprise on his face. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. He collapsed into the dust, his reign of terror over. A stunned silence fell over the canyon, broken only by the whisper of the wind. Justice, when it finally came, had not been delivered by a hero or a lawman. It had come from the hands of a girl who had simply refused to be a victim any longer. The days that followed were a blur. A federal marshal, drawn by the newspaper stories and the rising tide of public outrage, finally arrived in Calidad. The town, now free from Kell's shadow, gave up its secrets. Arrests were made. The bounty hunters talked. The full, ugly scope of Kell's operation was laid bare. Justice began its slow, imperfect work. Jedediah Hollis pinned his old badge back on his chest, this time for good. Months later, when the dust had settled and the first snows of winter were beginning to dust the high peaks, Eli and Annabelle returned to the abandoned church. It was still a ruin, but to them, it was a sanctuary. With help from Samuel and the Petrov brothers, they began to rebuild. They did not just mend the roof and replace the broken windows. They built a home. Word spread quietly through the territory, a whisper on the wind. There was a safe place now, a place for those who were running, for those who had been lost. Slowly, they came. A boy who had run away from a cruel apprenticeship. 2 young sisters orphaned by a cattle raid. A girl who had escaped a life much like the one Annabelle had known. The church, once silent and empty, was filled with the sounds of life. Eli, his shoulder healed to a puckered scar, taught the boys how to ride, how to mend a fence, how to be strong without being cruel. His gentleness was a balm to their wounded spirits. Annabelle, her hair now simply braided down her back, her face free of the saloon's paint and sorrow, taught the girls how to read and write. She gave them the words they would need to tell their own stories, to own their own futures. She was giving them the one thing that had been stolen from her, a choice. One evening, as the sun set, casting long purple shadows across the land, they stood together in the church doorway, watching the children play. The air was crisp and cold. Eli put his arm around her, and she leaned her head against his chest. The slow, steady beat of his heart, a comforting rhythm beneath her ear. She looked out at the vast, empty landscape, then up at his face. She had to say it one last time, not as a confession, but as a final release, a closing of a door on a dark room. "I am no virgin," she whispered, her voice soft against the fabric of his shirt. He smiled, a gentle, knowing smile that reached his eyes. He brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, his touch as tender as a prayer. "I know," he replied, his voice a low, loving rumble. "And I love you more for surviving." The wind howled outside, a lonely, wild sound, a reminder of the world and all its ghosts. The past had not vanished. Its scars remained, on his body and on her soul, but it no longer owned them. They had taken its broken pieces and built something new. The story ends with Annabelle turning from the doorway and lighting a single lantern. She carried it to the window, the one that faced the long, dark road, and set it on the sill. Its golden light a small, defiant star against the encroaching night, a welcome for anyone else who needed a place to begin again. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect, and invite you to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.